So, Thor Love and Thunder. If you would have told me that out of all of Phase 4, that it would be a Thor film that makes me completely lose hope for the future of the MCU, I would have thought you were completely insane. I didn't think that anything after Avengers Endgame was going to reach that level of hype again, but Phase 4 has been an underwhelming and jumbled mess. There seems to be little to no direction and oversaturation of content, with half of that being the horribly paced Disney Plus series. And the two films that I thought would redeem it all were incredible disappointments. Thor is an original Avenger, one of the big three. He was meant to bring the MCU back to a somewhat higher standard, in my opinion. Unfortunately, it doesn't go that way. Two of the biggest plot points of this new film, those being one, how Jane Foster becomes worthy, and two, the story of Gorr and how it culminates in the ending, were completely ruined by hand-wavy bullshit that I did not expect out of a movie based off of the Gorr the God-butcher story. Another point I know some people on social media were worried about would be how quote-unquote gay the movie would be based on comments by some of the stars. It really wasn't, except for Korg, aka the Taika Waititi self-insert who over-explains everything, including how two Cronins make a baby. I swear, it feels like some studio executive went to him and said, "Hey, so we're trying to check that box on queer representation, so what we need from you is to have your self-insert character explain in detail how two male Cronins procreate. We'll just shove that scene in the middle of the film somewhere and then tack it on again at the end for good measure." This small part at the beginning with the Guardians of the Galaxy was okay. You know, they were there in the film. It wasn't super important, although I'd say the writing in those couple of scenes was a little bit better than what we get in the rest of the film. Overall, the tone of the film was all over the place. It goes from weird 80s action to rom-com to serious and emotional to, there's a silly scene with children fighting monsters. And then it goes to disgustingly cheesy to an ending that you would expect for a movie written for toddlers. Now, that right there was the really broad strokes, generalized, non-spoiler portion of the review. The spoilers start now, and while I would prefer that you keep watching, if you haven't already seen the movie and want to form your own opinion, I completely understand if you want to back out. So, spoilers start now. Now, one of the ways that this film could be described is that it was a cheesy rom-com written by a middle-aged suburban white mom. Those aren't my words. That's actually the opinion of my wife, Heather, who is a casual fan. She's seen all the movies, but she isn't really as interested in reading comics. However, before going to see this film, I was able to convince her to read the 11 issues of Thor God of Thunder that make up the Gorr the God-butcher story, because I was curious to see what her reaction would be after the fact, and so this is her part of the review.
What's up, everyone? Heather here. So like Jacob said, I'm not a diehard Marvel comic book fan, but I do enjoy reading them every once in a while. I usually don't read the comics prior to watching the Marvel movies, and I'm just the casual fan watching whatever storyline Disney throws at me. And by the end of the movie, my opinions usually differ from Jacob's, and that's just because he's read the comics and I haven't. This time around, he was able to convince me to read Gorr the God-butcher prior to watching the newest Thor. And afterwards, our opinions were pretty on par with each other. To start things off, my thoughts on Thor Love and Thunder would have been the same even if I hadn't read Gorr the God-butcher. I would have walked out of the movie theater saying, wow, that was a disappointing movie. Overall, it felt like a cheesy rom-com with Gorr the God-butcher thrown in as their evil villain. For those of you who have watched Jacob's previous videos on Gorr the God-butcher or have actually read the comic yourself, you know that Gorr's journey into becoming this evil God Butcher is just that, a journey. Whereas in the movie, it felt like a split-second decision. In the comics, you see Gorr's journey throughout his life where he is losing family, losing his faith, and in the end, it turns him into Gorr the God-butcher, set out to destroy all the gods. Versus in the movie, he is faithful until he meets one god that he's been worshiping for his entire life. That god turns out to be a dick, and that's what turns him into being someone who has to kill all the gods. Doesn't really make sense. Another gripe I had that was more comic related was the god bomb, or the lack thereof. In the comics, that is the ending plot point. That is the thing that everyone has to band together to fight, along with Gorr. And in the movie, it was essentially a wishing well and choosing love, which didn't really feel like Gorr the God-butcher. I know the movie is called Thor, Love, and Thunder, but if you're going to incorporate Gorr the God-butcher, you gotta have a little bit more evil in there. They also had kids fighting Gorr, which seemed a little weird considering that their parents were unable to fight Gorr the God-butcher. And yes, I know the kids got Thor's powers temporarily, but it still felt a little off to me. Also, at the end, with Thor eventually adopting Gorr's daughter, seemed kind of weird and out of character for him. Especially considering that in the comics, we're going through a journey with Thor. We're looking for clues with him. He's remembering his past. We're piecing things together. And eventually, you, along with Thor, figure out that it's Gorr the God-butcher who is doing all these things. Versus in the movie, it's a conveniently placed Sif who tells Thor all about Gorr and what he's done. Now, I'm a huge believer on show don't tell when it comes to story plot points, so this alone felt very lazy. As for the rest of the characters, the only one that I walked out of the theater still liking was Valkyrie, and that's because she remained the same kicking butt Valkyrie that I've grown to love over the past few movies. Jane, on the other hand, turned from a smart, beautiful scientist into this cheesy superhero. And don't get me wrong, she had some awkward lines in the previous Thor movies, but it wasn't her entire character. In Thor, Love, and Thunder, she was just a ball of awkwardness. And honestly, the only scenes that I actually enjoyed with her in it were the fight scenes, and that was because she wasn't talking as much. Thor also felt a little weird to me in this movie versus the previous ones I've seen of him in other movies. And part of me thinks that is just because with Korg telling the story, I know he was just the intro, but the whole movie felt like it was from Korg's point of view, or Korg's rendition of Thor. And that might be why Thor acted so differently than how we'd seen him previously. And as weird as the other characters were for me for this movie, nothing was as weird as Thor's relationship with his hammers. I understood as a casual viewer that the hammers were magical. They might have had some kind of thought, but not to the degree that was shown here in Thor, Love, and Thunder. It felt very awkward and very weird and randomly thrown in there, probably for comedic effect, like the screaming goats, which were funny at first, but got very annoying by the end of the movie. I did enjoy the part where all the gods and goddesses were in the same council room together and the amount of detail and work that went into each of those gods and goddesses. It was a lot of fun for me to look throughout the crowd and see the different types in there. However, once Zeus opened his mouth, it kind of ruined that magic for me. And that's just because every time he spoke, all I could hear was the Caesar's pizza, little pizza guy with his fake Italian accent. Not saying that his accent wasn't him trying, it just sounded very forced from my point of view. All in all, this movie for me did not live up to its potential at all and did not leave me excited for whatever Marvel has planned in the future.
So back to my part of the review, I'm going to try to not really rehash too much of what my wife has already touched on, and it's going to be very character focused. So first, I want to talk about what I thought and what I think a lot of comic book fans assumed was going to be one of the worst parts of the film, that being Jane Foster. I will say right off the bat, her part in the movie is not as bad as I thought it would be, but don't get too excited about that. There are still problems with how she was written. So first off, they're adapting the cancer storyline from The Mighty Thor, where she is undergoing chemotherapy, but every time she wields Mjolnir, it drains her human strength, leaving her weaker and more sick every time. So she has to decide to either stop being a hero so that she can get healthy, or shorten her lifespan but take on a more fulfilling role. And that sums up her journey in the film. So, spoiler, she decides to be a hero in the end. She dies, and in the post-credit scene, she ends up in Valhalla, where she is greeted by Heimdall. Honestly, there's no substance to the post-credit scene. I'm not sure what the purpose was, if it was just to show us that she died a hero's death, or if it's leading to something in the future. The real problems with her character come up in how she got her powers, and honestly, in her overall portrayal. So you would imagine that Jane Foster becoming Thor would be this big deal, and that they'd come up with a really interesting way of showing how she gets her powers. But instead, it happens off-screen. And the way that they explain her worthiness is through a rom-com montage, which is meant to get us up to date on how the Thor-Jane romance progressed and eventually ended. Because remember, after Thor the Dark World, Jane Foster just vanished. But they also explain that Thor made Mjolnir promise that would always protect Jane, and his love somehow affected the worthiness enchantment on the hammer, making her worthy, which is easily one of the laziest asspulls in movie history. As for her portrayal, Jane Foster is meant to be this really smart, logical astrophysicist. At least that's how she was portrayed in Thor 1 and 2. And yeah, she had the role of the smitten love interest with Thor in those movies as well. But as soon as she becomes Thor, she turns into this awkward pastiche of Thor. Take all the worst parts of a cheesy action hero and Jane Foster, smash them together, and you get the mighty, not Lady Thor, Dr. Jane Foster. And she made it almost the whole movie without making some cringy girl power statement, up until Gorr calls her Lady Thor, and she says, "You will call me Mighty Thor, or if you can't, then Dr. Jane Foster." And it's annoying because she could have been a much better character. She had a couple real moments in the film, like one moment during the middle where she's alone in the bathroom and she starts to feel Mjolnir draining her life force. And she has this flashback to when it seems like her mom had cancer as well. And you can tell that it's really taking a toll on her, and Valkyrie walks in and asks if she's okay, and you actually start to feel for her character. And then they immediately ruin it with bad humor. Marvel sabotages the characters that they claim to care about the most, I think. Let's move on, though, to, strangely, my favorite character in the film, which is Valkyrie. Another character that many fans were worried was going to add forced diversity to the film. And you know what? It didn't feel like that at all. And I'm saying that with 100% sincerity. They do subtly mention that she is, like, bi or lesbian or whatever, by some jokes that she makes regarding Jane, as well as mentioning her dead girlfriend who was a Valkyrie. But those moments added depth to her character. You actually feel for her. Her past is tragic, but she stepped up to be the king when Thor left. And yet she also still has this warrior spirit. She still wants to go out there and fight. She loves battle, and that makes her a fun character. Her portrayal was the most consistent of any other, not just throughout this movie, but throughout the MCU. I never thought I'd say this, but her part in this movie is diversity done right, which I've never said about an MCU character before. Now, I still think it's stupid to have black Asgardians in the whitest pantheon on Earth. And while there are Asgardians in the movie of different races, it seems to be a result of true Asgardians having reproduced with the Norwegian population since they moved to Earth. Though Heimdall and Valkyrie were there before that. And I would still have rather had Brunhilde from the comics. Let's talk about Gorr, the main villain. Really the biggest draw of this film for those who read the God-butcher story, which I don't even feel is worth summarizing after that movie. It's just not worth it. If you want to know his story from the comics, you can watch my videos explaining it. I'm not going to take the time to explain it here. Basically, I expected a hell of a lot more from Christian Bale. Honestly, the way that he portrayed this character, his design change from the comics is the least of anyone's worries. For some reason, Christian Bale looked at Gorr as a character and thought, you know what, I'm going to play him by mixing together Batman and Joker. Gorr is a vengeful force of nature in the comics. He is a human-level being with powers that make him a god, going around the universe hunting down, torturing, and killing gods. It takes 3 Thors in the comics just to give Gorr a run for his money. In the movie, he's like an angry but playful imp, jumping in and out of the shadows. Most of his fighting is done by shadow creatures that he summons, which gets repetitive really fucking fast. And in the end, what changes his mind is the power of love. Thor chooses love, and that just fixes everything. But let me go back a little bit. So in the movie, Gorr and his daughter are the last survivors of worshippers of this sun god on some unknown planet. His daughter dies. He stumbles upon this magical jungle in the desert and finds the sun god there, celebrating the death of the wielder of the Necrosword, which Marvel explains as just being a cursed blade. Its origins and connection to Null, the symbiote god, aren't mentioned, which is extremely disappointing. And it is fairly easily broken at the end of the movie, which I don't think should be possible. But anyways, this sun god ends up being a huge asshole. Gorr is crying over the death of his daughter, begging the god to give him his eternal reward for his undying faith. And the god just laughs in his face. He's like, yeah, I don't actually care about you. There is no afterlife, and once you die, I'll just get new followers somewhere else. This drives Gorr to pick up the Necrosword and start his quest to kill all the gods. Except unlike the comics, where he's going to build a bomb using the heart of the first Elder God, a bomb that will traverse all time and space, which would have been really cool to see, instead his purpose is to find eternity and make a wish to end all gods. Eternity in the comics is one half of the personification of the universe itself. It is a living being, but it rarely shows up to communicate with anyone other than the highest level cosmic beings. But in the movie, it's just a Buddha statue that you make wishes to. And after seeing Thor's love for Jane Foster, Gorr decides to wish for his daughter to come back to life, which she does, and then he dies due to the curse of the Necrosword. There isn't a word or phrase that accurately describes how I feel about the portrayal of Gorr in this film, so I'll just say it was shit. Marvel Studios had a chance to do something truly epic with the Gorr the God-butcher storyline, and they completely fucked it up. Now let's talk about Thor. This movie reminded me that we haven't seen Thor in the MCU since Thor the Dark World. And I know everyone hates that movie, but you know what? I think it's the most accurate portrayal of Thor's character from the comics. He was a powerful, serious, stoic warrior who didn't feel the need to crack a joke anytime there's a tense scene, which is what Thor has become. His entire existence in the MCU now is relegated to the bumbling oaf that exists for us to laugh at when things get too serious. Which is a problem when you consider the fans, because if the studio doesn't take the character seriously, then why should we? Why should I pay money to see you misrepresent a beloved character? Flashy action scenes doesn't make up for poor writing. So when the movie starts, Thor is in this weird funk where it's revealed that he has gotten used to the fact that he'll lose anyone close to him and that he's only good for fighting. Which is very obvious with the opening act where he quote-unquote helps an alien race reclaim their sacred temple from an enemy, but destroys it in the process. So it's apparent that Thor has lost the idea of what it means to be a hero, and you understand that he's going to go through some type of journey throughout the movie where he remembers how to be a hero again by the end. Except that we didn't really see that journey, because that plot was interrupted by the Thor-Jane romance plot, which also went from point A to point C, skipping past B, partially due to the other plot, but also because we hadn't seen Jane Foster since 2014. It's also interrupted by the Gorr plot, which in the comic, Thor trying to figure out what it means to be a hero and a god is tied into the plot with Gorr, but in the movie, it just doesn't work as well. Thor doesn't have the history with Gorr that he does in the comics, and the movie doesn't have the depth of either character to give either of their stories any real importance. A complaint I have about Thor that I think is one that most people don't share is the fact that it's weird to me that Thor doesn't talk about Tony Stark or Steve Rogers being gone. I mean, they were his comrades on and off for 11 years. It makes sense for them to not really be mentioned in the other Phase 4 projects because those other characters don't have any connection to the Avengers. Except Falcon and Winter Soldier, where they do talk about Steve a few times. Hawkeye misses Natasha, Peter misses Tony, but Thor knew the original Avengers longer than Sam and Peter did. Again, it's more of a nitpick. At the end of the film, after Gorr brings his daughter back to life and Gorr dies, Thor adopts her. So now he's playing dad, and his adopted daughter is wielding Stormbreaker while he wields Mjolnir again. Where the hell did that come from? What does learning to be a hero again have to do with adopting the villain's child? It just came so far out of left field. And lastly, the way they treated Thor wasn't solely relegated to him, but to all gods in the movie. Russell Crowe's Zeus was an absolute joke. With his forced accent, the way they had him daintily walk down a staircase while holding up his skirt, and more focused on orgies than the greater universe, it was embarrassing to watch. He acted nothing like his comic book counterpart. I'd made a video where I talked about modern mythology and how current day writers can't help but put their own everyday failings into characters of myth and legend, and pretty much what I predicted would happen happened. There's even the mid-credit scene where Zeus complains that people treat gods like they're a joke, before summoning Hercules to go after Thor. So yeah, Hercules is in the MCU now. It'd be more exciting if I hadn't just watched Marvel bastardize all of Earth's gods. So was Zeus' comment meant to be an example of self-awareness by the writers regarding how they treat gods in the MCU? Because let me tell you, self-awareness can be clever when used sparingly, but it doesn't make up for shitty writing. If you can't tell, I found this film to be sickeningly disappointing. If you haven't already watched the film, save yourself some time and money and disappointment and go read the God-butcher storyline instead. It'll be far more rewarding. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like and subscribe button. Also hit that notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.